make the first, it works. In making the second, we knew we had something going. By Goldfinger, we had a cultural phenomenon.
It's safe to say that Bond mania started with Goldfinger. Audiences around the globe gathered to see 007's latest adventure. Sean Connery, now an international movie star, dropped women's panties all around the world. The coolest guy every man wanted to be. James Bond was the trendsetter. And it's hard to imagine nowadays, but Bond was as big as the Beatles. Merchandise everywhere. I don't think Bond ever quite reached that same level of popularity that it did in the mid-60s. So it's pointless to deny that Goldfinger had made James Bond a phenomenon. A highly successful movie that all future Bond films try to live up to. The ingredients for this film, for one, director Terence Young, who directed the first two Bond films, didn't return as reportedly he demanded a paycheck that the producers couldn't meet. So director Guy Hamilton was brought on. It's worth pointing out that Guy Hamilton was already offered to direct Dr. No, but turned it down at the time. Production designer Ken Adam also returned after his absence from Russia with Love. But what was the key to this film's success? What made this film so special? And does that still apply today? The book Goldfinger, Fleming's seventh 007 novel, isn't necessarily the best book in the series. I would claim both Dr. No and From Russia with Love are the superior novels. I made in-depth reviews on all of those in my Reading 007 series if you're curious about my thoughts on the books. Some Bond fans out there claim that this film is somewhat overrated. Is there some merit to that, or is this truly simply a masterpiece? That's what we're going to be looking at today as I dive into the classic of all classics. Starting us off again with the now signature gun barrel sequence, the same one used in the first two films. Us Bond fans always like to point out that in the first three films, it's not actually Sean Connery in that gun barrel, but stuntman Bob Simmons. It is Sean Connery coming out of the water with that duck on his head though. Only he could make that look cool. Continuing the tradition started in From Russia with Love, the Bond films now started off with a pre-title sequence. But this time, this whole sequence was completely unrelated to the rest of the plot. A bit of an appetizer, if you will. Or, as director Guy Hamilton called it, a wonderful piece of nonsense. And you can totally see that that is what this mini-adventure delivers. Only Bond could come out of the water, with his hair still looking perfect, planting a bomb in some facility, walk out, taking off his wetsuit to reveal a perfect white tuxedo, walk into a bar, lights his cigarette at the exact moment the bomb explodes. A wonderful piece of nonsense indeed, one that hits the nail in the head. Connery is at his A-game once again. I mean, just look at the guy. All of that screaming and cheering that they did when Connery appeared is just not hard to understand in the slightest. The man just looks the business, and you totally want to be this guy. If the belly dancer he's checking out at the bar looks familiar to you, that is because she is, as she previously played Karen Bass Girl in From Russia with Love. Another aspect often seen within Bond. recasting actors or actresses that had already starred in a different part previously. Of course, Bond is the one that takes her back to his hotel room, but not before noticing the reflection of a bad guy sneaking up on him. So naturally, he uses her as a shield, because she must be working with that guy. Well, do we know for sure? No. But we're just witnessing a wonderful piece of nonsense in which Bond disables the guy in his bathtub only to utter the iconic line,
Shocking.
and so the King of Cool exits the hotel room and enters the title sequence. Already you can notice a difference in tone compared to the previous two Bond films by Terence Young. Whereas those two felt like an extension and imagining of the Bond novels post-1950s, here the tone is much more that of a light-hearted and fun approach, not necessarily taken from the novels, but the film started to develop its own identity. It now feels like we've truly entered the bombastic era of the 1960s, and this wonderful mini-adventure was the perfect appetizer of what the cinematic Bond would become in this film. The title song is of course sung by Shirley Bassey, another ingredient that made this film so iconic. I don't rank this song in my top 10 Bond title songs, but Shirley Bassey is clearly the singer you associate with James Bond, and it's no coincidence she ended up becoming the only singer to date that did multiple Bond title songs. The titles itself, which by the way is done by Robert Brownjohn again, like From Russia With Love, not Maurice Binder, also shares that unique Goldfinger iconography, showcasing snippets of scenes yet to come in the film, and even a sequence that never made it into the movie. And also, you gotta appreciate that golf ball going directly into the cleavage. I mean, that's just genius. Altogether, even when watching these titles all these decades after the movie's release, it just feels like you're about to watch something special. I can't really put my finger on to why. Maybe it's the bombastic grand feel of Bassey's song, or simply the golden imagery, but I'm willing to bet even a perfect stranger to this film can feel it. That feeling of this movie just being a different animal compared to the rest. A feeling you're in for something special, classic, and timeless. And that feeling continues after the titles, with the film just seeming so proud to present itself with its grand music opening on Miami. This is where the film starts to get into that actual plot and takes a simplified approach to the beginning of the novel. Bond is out relaxing at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, being massaged by some random babe named Dink. Fun fact about her, by the way, she's played by Margaret Nolan, and she was also starring as the Golden Girl in the title sequence. While I mentioned before that it would become a trope of the series to recast the same actors and actresses in different parts, it sadly would also become a trope to recast different actors for the same parts, and Felix Leiter is the prime example. Something I always felt that was just a great shame. In the cinematic Bond universe, we are first introduced to Felix Leiter in Dr. No, with Jack Lord having that same sort of swagger that mimics Bond. He was unavailable for Goldfinger, but instead of going for a similar actor, we now get Zach Linder, who just looks 20 years older and is a completely different type of Felix. It's such a shame the filmmakers always seemed so indifferent to whoever plays Felix, as this would become a trend as the series would progress. Bond meets up with Felix and says goodbye to Dink.
Felix, say hello to Dink.
Hi, Dink.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
Now this, of course, looking through the lens of today's society, is a moment that you could say hasn't aged the best. Some would probably even claim it's controversial. When attempting to look at this within the context of the 60s though, I feel this was supposed to be a far more innocent and mundane moment instead of being demeaning in any way. Again, through the lens of the 60s. Though it's quite obvious that the actors aren't actually on location here, as it cuts to a studio setting of the hotel with some obvious back projections. Yet somehow the film gets away with it and it feels charming. Like when we are first introduced to Mr. Arik Goldfinger himself, and you can clearly see that it's a stand-in in the wide shot on location, but then it's Gert Frobe himself for the close-up in the studio.
Or a Goldfinger. Sounds like a French nail varnish.
So, Gert Frobe, in my opinion, perfectly casted, which says a lot because not only was he a German actor, he also pretty much only spoke German. He is dubbed throughout the whole movie by Michael Collins, and it's probably one of the best dubbing jobs in existence. The older Bond movies are full of dubbing, and it's just so seamless you wouldn't even notice if you hadn't known. There were plenty of other actors auditioning for the role of Goldfinger, who each spoke English much better than Gert Frobe. And while these actors did put in solid auditions for the part, nobody just came close to Gert Frobe. Even when reading the book, I can only picture him as Goldfinger. So Goldfinger is a very wealthy man who Bond is asked to keep an eye out for by M, and he's suspected to be cheating playing gin. And gee, I wonder how he pulls that off. So Bond soon goes, hey, maybe it has something to do with that immense headphone plugged into his ear. In the book, Goldfinger used the excuse of being deaf and tells his opponent he has agoraphobia and can't stand wide open space. Therefore, he must face the hotel. Here, the movie takes a better excuse with him taking his usual seat because of his suntan. Bond easily walks into the hotel, getting the key to Goldfinger's suite off the maid, who just walks off hilariously, as if that didn't just happen. Aw, that man just called me sweet. And Bond, of course, finds a half-naked woman, Jill Masterson, on the balcony aiding Goldfinger with a pair of binoculars.
Who are you?
Bond. James Bond.
And again, the film somehow manages to be cool and charming here, while the back projection is plainly obvious and not even in the right proportion in relation to the balcony. The ocean and pool area is way too high, and yet you have a huge smile on your face in the way Connery interacts with Shirley Eaton. He just has that natural way of charming women. Much like when he charmed Miss Taro in Dr. No or Tatiana in From Russia with Love. You can totally believe that Shirley Eaton would genuinely fall for Connery off camera too. So in a fantastic moment, Bond exposes Goldfinger's cheating and blackmails him into losing now, which totally pisses off Goldfinger and is one of those great one-uppings of the villain moments that just leaves you grinning from ear to ear. And that grin doesn't really stop there. Not only has Bond have him pay back a few grand, he also steals his girl because, well, it's been a good 15 minutes since she's had a woman. So Bond just steals Goldfinger's girl and bangs her in his own suite.
Oh, look, I'm sorry. I can't. Something big's come up.
He means his cock.
So after sleeping with Jill, we get this curious moment of Bond commenting on the Beatles.
My dear girl, there are some things that just aren't done. Such as drinking Dom Perignon 53 above a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
Looking at this line in the context of 1964, the conservative man that Bond is wasn't exactly the target demographic of the Beatles. So it kind of makes sense that Bond wouldn't be a fan in this moment in time. It's ironic though, considering Paul McCartney would sing a Bond title song a decade later and Ringo's wife would become a future Bond girl. Anyway, it's here where Bond is suddenly knocked out cold by a mysterious henchman with a bowler hat. And he must have been out by that jab for a long time as he wakes up to Jill Masterson being fully painted in gold. And though logically it raises way too many questions like how is she killed by paint and how did they manage to do it without staining the sheets and all that? But it truly is such an iconic and impressive image that just never fails to resonate. It's just one of the many elements of Goldfinger's iconography that just makes this film such a classic Bond film. So the movie moves back to London and M is obviously pissed at Bond for borrowing Goldfinger's girl instead of observing him. And I like these moments where it's obvious that M is the only authority in Bond's life. And you can see Bond is pissed too, probably more at himself for assuming there were no consequences or dangers to exposing the car cheating and not being on guard more. Though I also like to think he's somewhat mad at Goldfinger killing the innocent Jill. He's quickly back to his flirty self though 1 minute later with Moneypenny. So later that night, Bond meets up with Colonel Smithers to learn more about gold and receives the mission to investigate Goldfinger, who's suspected of smuggling his gold. And remember how I said in my Dr. No review how people just seem to look older back in the day? Actors like Taron Egerton or Zac Efron are now older than Connery was in Dr. No. Now to prove my point more, take Colonel Smithers. How old do you think he was at the time of this film? In his 60s or perhaps in his 50s? No, he was 39. 39! The guy hadn't even reached his 40s yet. Pierce Brosnan was older at the time he first became Bond. Guess that's what the war and smoking does to you. Before setting out for his mission to investigate Goldfinger, we get the first proper Q scene. And this is yet another example of how Goldfinger set the standard for the cinematic Bond. Whereas the previous two felt much more like the novels and the character of Q was more or less a serious quartermaster, handing over some equipment in M's office. Here, Q is at his lab, handing out Bond's gadgets. And it was Guy Hamilton who suggested to Desmond Llewellyn to not have any respect towards Bond because he messes up his equipment. Because originally Llewellyn wanted to play Q with a lot of admiration towards Bond, but Hamilton told him, no, he doesn't respect your stuff. You shouldn't respect him. It's here where that fun dynamic between Bond and Q is first established. So it's definitely not just Terence Young that put a lasting stamp on the franchise. Guy Hamilton did it too. And it's also here where the at the time brand new Aston Martin DB5 is first introduced. As you know, DB stands for definitely badass. 5. The coolest car in all of Bond. Marty McFly has the DeLorean. Batman has the Batmobile. Bond has the DB5. It's funny to think the filmmakers probably just chose it because in the novel Goldfinger, Bond poses as a rich man and gets to drive the Aston Martin DB3 to fit his cover. So they probably just used it and updated it because of the novel, likely not realizing the icon it would grow out to be and the impact it would have on the series. All these decades later, every man would still want to have this thing. I mean, it has revolving number plates, machine guns, a smokescreen, a built-in radar totally predating sat-nav and Google Maps, and even an ejector seat.
Ejector seat? You're joking.
So, equipped with a bar of gold as bait, Bond is sent out to start his dangerous investigation by playing golf. And as tedious as that sounds, the movie succeeds in gripping you throughout the entire sequence. That moment of Goldfinger and Bond sort of re-meeting each other is really good. Even when both characters are only saying how do you do in the dialogue, the underlying subtext can be felt. You can tell Goldfinger is sizing Bond up, likely already aware that he was the guy that caught him with the cheating in Miami and then stole his girl. But you can also tell Bond is doing the same, both giving that stare. The novel constantly mentions Goldfinger having an X-ray gaze, looking straight into the back of Bond's skull multiple times. And I guess this is sort of the adaptation of that. This is also where we meet Goldfinger's iconic right-hand man, Oddjob. The music and the bowler hat immediately clue us in that he's the same guy that knocked Bond out in the hotel suite in Miami. Oddjob is played by Harold Sakata and is definitely in the top 2 most iconic henchmen in all of Bond. So, as the game starts, Bond gets down to business and showcases the bait, clearly Goldfinger's weakness as he misses a very easy shot. Of course, much like he did playing cards in Miami, Goldfinger also cheats his way through golf, having a new ball planted in a more ideal location through Oddjob's pants. This allows for Bond to once again outsmart him.
If that's his original ball, I'm Arnold Palmer.
It isn't.
How do you know?
I'm standing on it. 1 to go, that'll be the clincher.
Fine.
You play a Schlesinger 1, don't you? You must have played the wrong ball somewhere on the 18th fairway. I'm afraid you lose the hole and the match.
There's just something so satisfying in watching Bond expose this cheat once again and not having Goldfinger get away with it. It's just impossible not to smile at Connery's cunningness and Goldfinger's anger. Before saying their goodbyes, Goldfinger gives Bond a warning to make sure they don't cross paths again, having Oddjob demonstrate his signature attack. This is the kind of stuff you would only see in a Bond movie, especially at the time, and it's just so brilliant. At the same time, it sets up Oddjob as a dangerous, overpowered villain, even capable of crushing a golf ball, preheating the moment we know is coming that Bond eventually has to face him. Now in the novel there was a whole sequence following all this where Bond would get invited to Goldfinger's mansion and he would snoop around there and all that. None of that is in the movie though, and I guess for the pacing's sake they made the right call in dropping all that. Instead, Bond places a Homer on Goldfinger's car and follows him down to Switzerland to see what he's up to there. This is definitely the best looking location Bond visits in this entire film. Cinematically, all of this just looks so stunning. There's just something about seeing a DB5 drive around in 1960s Switzerland. This is also where a new lady shows up, driving a Ford Thunderbird, which Bond is tempted to follow as well, but he sticks to the mission. Later on, he finds Goldfinger having a stop to visit the most random fruit stand I've ever seen. But I'm obviously not from Switzerland, so I asked a Swiss Bond friend of mine if this is something common, and yeah, it actually totally is, especially in the Alps, so, the more you know. We also got a moment that as a first-time viewer could totally make you believe that the Ford Thunderbird girl is trying to kill Bond and is in cahoots with Goldfinger. Especially because Oddjob gives that random smile after the shot. This of course does motivate Bond to go after the girl and find out who she is, in a 1960s car chase in the Alps, which is such an upgrade to the one that we see in Dr. No, even if it's not really a deadly chase as opposed to Bond just overtaking her like a maniac, it's still beautifully filmed, especially for the time. It also allows for the first ever on-screen use of gadgets on a Bond car, where Bond uses his drill to destroy not just her tires, but the entire side of her car, which brings one of the most hilariously dated moments of the girl coming to a stop. I just can never help but laugh at that moment. Also funny to me is how Bond totally acts all innocent after doing that.
Are you all right? You know you're lucky to be alive.
No thanks to you. Look at them.
Defect of some kind, most likely.
Ah yes, a defect of some kind. I mean, forget about the tires, how does he not address that the entire side of the car is ripped to shreds? How did she miss that? Anyway, we of course soon find out her name is Tilly. She's played by Tanya Male, who was a model at the time. Fun fact about her is that she originally auditioned for the role of Tatiana Romanova in the previous film. Bond does some questioning, and she's totally being suspicious and lies about her last name. And then he just drops her off and he keeps his eye on the mission? Wow, he doesn't even give her his card so he can bang her later on. He must have really learned something after Miami. But the mission is Goldfinger, and he is out at a factory doing stuff. Stuff Bond needs to find out. And how gorgeous is this shot of the DB5 with this backdrop, by the way. Beautiful. So Bond waits around until the sun goes down and hops into stealth mode. And much like the opening of the film, he gets to sneak around in one of those reconnaissance suits. And I really wish we got more of that in modern day Bond. I just love that stuff. The music amplifying, the quiet tension, Bond doing stealthy spying while avoiding the guards, or, well, Asians in pajamas. It's just great. Having briefly visited Pinewood Studios in October 2022, I'm pretty sure that is where this is filmed, just outside of the studios. Anyway, Bond finds out that Goldfinger is indeed smuggling gold through the bodywork of his Rolls Royce. And I mentioned the dubbing of Goldfinger being superb and unnoticeable throughout the film. That is with the exception of this scene.
Which in turn will be this weighing approximately 2 tons. Now, Mr. Ling, please assure your principals Operation Grand Slam will have my undivided attention.
It's very minor anyway, and I was never too bothered about it, but it's just obvious that the dialogue was added in post. So Bond overhears Operation Grand Slam. For now, just a meaningless word. As he moves back into the forest around the factory, he runs into Tilly again. Tilly turns out to be named Tilly Masterson, the sister of Jill, and is out for revenge to kill Goldfinger, because he killed her sister. So she wasn't aiming at Bond before, but at Goldfinger, but missed by like 100 miles. So what is her plan to try and kill Goldfinger from here when he's inside the factory? You know, protected by a concrete wall. Also, I'm kinda glad that Tanya Male didn't get to be Tatiana Romanova in From Russia with Love. Her acting in this particular scene.
Let me go! You're breaking my back! I want him dead. He killed my sister.
Tilly Masters. I knew your sister Jill. I know what he did to her in Miami.
No, you don't. Let me go.
It's just god-awful. It's like she can't contain her smile being held by Connery, and she's just saying the dialogue she's supposed to, and it's a bit cringeworthy. And why would she even question Bond knowing her sister when clearly he knows all the facts? In her defense, she wasn't an actress, but that kind of shows too. She does manage to accidentally set off the alarm though, and the pair have to escape Oddjob and Goldfinger's goons in yet another car chase. This was also filmed near Pinewood in Black Park, right behind the studios, another place I visited in real life. The car chase itself is alright, although a bit silly in places. Bond gets to use the smokescreen and drop some oil, while Tilly really looks like she's having the time of her life being chased by bloodthirsty murderers. One of the chasing cars slips off a cliff and explodes for no real reason at all. They really did like the cars exploding midway off a cliff thing in the 60s, huh? And then they run into a dead end and Bond is like, "Quick! I'll pull up this bulletproof shield protecting us from guns and throwable bowler hats. I better stay behind it. You run off right in the open." And of course Tilly is killed. First off, what the hell, Bond? And second off, how did that bowler hat not leave a single scratch when killing her, while it decapitated a stone statue before at the golf place? Oh shit, I didn't even get to shag her yet. Thanks to Bond, both of the Masterson sisters got killed. It's not exactly his finest hour. She didn't get killed at this point in the book, by the way. Tilly stayed around right up until the climax in that one. I do believe the filmmakers made the right call in sacrificing her earlier for the film, as the main Bond girl is yet to be introduced and she wouldn't really serve any meaningful purpose to still be around at that point of the script. So Bond is captured and somehow is lucky enough to still be allowed to drive his own car and have the guard conveniently sit right next to him in the ejector seat.
The bad guy gets on the ejector seat, never gets in the back. Drive, Mr. Band. I am in the back with the gun pointing at you. You will drive. Would you like to sit up in the front here?
The actual execution of Bond using the ejector seat to launch the guard out is still cool though. And Bond gets to make a second escape attempt. I never know why exactly Goldfinger would have an 80-year-old granny busting out a machine gun as the first line of defense, but I always found it strangely hilarious. Or maybe this is another one of those people used to look older things, and she's actually 36. Who knows? In any case, Bond once again manages to screw up thinking there's a car coming straight at him, while he has no way out, so he just drives into a wall. and it turns out to be just the reflection of a mirror. How on earth did he fall for such a cheap trick? Plus the mirror seems to be hanging much higher and seems really small. This is what stopped 007? You see, fans who claim that Goldfinger is overrated certainly get to hit their point home with these past couple of scenes. Besides looking like the coolest guy on the planet and one-upping Goldfinger twice in fantastic fashion, Bond really hasn't done much noteworthy stuff in terms of being successful in his mission. He got 2 women killed and now is captured. Does that writing make this an overrated movie though? On the contrary, I present to you my counter-argument, once again bringing us not just an iconic Bond moment, but one of the most memorable moments in all of cinema.
Do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
Bond strapped to the table with the laser slowly approaching him. People were at the edge of their seats for this scene in 1964, and they still are watching this today. The novel had Bond strapped to a table with a saw slowly reaching his privates. And again, I feel the filmmakers made the right call in updating it to a laser. For one, with a saw we probably wouldn't be able to hear the dialogue.
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
What did you say?
I expect you to die.
We're having pie?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.
It wouldn't have been the same. But in all seriousness, the scene is great. I think what makes it so gripping and tense is the fact that Goldfinger can't even be bothered to watch Bond get killed. He just walks off bored and speaks to some of his minions about whatever more important stuff is on his mind. As if killing Bond with a laser was just another chore that came up in the day for him. Meanwhile, the laser is still creeping in closer. Sweat is piling up on Bond's forehead, and Goldfinger is not in the slightest interested in Bond's fate. You really start to wonder how Bond is going to save himself out of this one. Attempting to mention 008 will replace him if he fails to report. Goldfinger doesn't care. Trying to throw the Operation Grand Slam out there. Goldfinger isn't moved. Must be something he just overheard. The laser still creeps in, but then Bond manages to raise slight doubt in Goldfinger's mind. There might be another agent after him after all. He might know something about his Grand Slam plan. And then the laser is switched off in the final second and Bond is tranquilized and imprisoned. This has to be one of the most memorable moments, not just in this film, but in all of Bond, and quite possibly in all of cinema. Bond finds himself waking up aboard of a private jet. We've now reached the exact halfway point of the film, and we're finally introduced to the main Bond girl.
Who are you?
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
Honor Blackman as Pussy Galore. Yet again, a classic Bond girl. I have to say though, I would have loved it if they used the original line that they had in mind for this introduction. I am Pussy Galore, but of course you are. But what's your name? Which would have been even more smooth and tongue-in-cheek, but they drew the line at that being too suggestive there. Really wish they went with that. In any case, Pussy Galore is changed quite a bit from her source material. Originally, Pussy didn't show up until later on and was a lesbian head of an American female group of gangsters. Here, all of that is dropped and Pussy is made to be Goldfinger's personal pilot. The lesbian thing is not really mentioned either, but there is this line.
You can turn off the charm. I'm immune.
One other thing about her though, and I've never really seen anyone mention this, so maybe it's me, but if you are Goldfinger's personal pilot, why isn't she being his personal pilot right now?
And by the way, where is our host?
He flew on ahead.
What? Why? So you're telling me she flew all the way from Kentucky or Baltimore to Switzerland and back being the personal pilot of Goldfinger, and Goldfinger just took some other private jet instead? Why does Goldfinger's personal pilot have to be the one to fly Bond to Baltimore? Why wouldn't Goldfinger take the same plane so he can keep an eye on Bond? I mean, he knows exactly what Bond is capable of when he's alone with women working under him. he might just charm them against him. Isn't that a colossal mistake on Goldfinger's part? Or, at the very least, why not have Oddjob aboard of this plane? Or Quiche, just in case? Nah, better just leave Bond all alone with my personal pilot and this cute-looking Asian girl with golden triangular tits. That'll show him. It doesn't take away from Connery oozing confidence and charm throughout this whole flight, fooling around with the shaving cream, knowing that Mai Li is keeping an eye on him, slipping the Homer into his shoe. All of this is still super entertaining. Also, you gotta appreciate this sneaky little callback to From Russia with Love. Remember the tear gas booby trap in the attache case?
My attache case?
Black attache case damaged when examined. So sorry.
Apologies quite unnecessary.
That is such a subtle way of showing continuity. And when watching Bond films in order, which definitely is my recommended way of first watching them, you might catch on to some of these little nods. You gotta appreciate it. Anyway, Bond slips into, quite possibly, the most timeless, smart-looking suit he ever wore. I mean, just look at this smooth son of a bitch. He has that factor of what Bond is all about. You want to be this bastard. Pushy, you know? This is just why we love Bond. So Bond lands in Baltimore. While Pussy Galore isn't the head of a female gangster group in this film, they still kept her as a leader of Pussy's Flying Circus. Featuring this squadron of blonde babes, complete with the stereotypical sexy music as they exit. The 60s. Classic. So Bond is taken to Goldfinger's ranch in Kentucky and is imprisoned there. It's kind of questionable why Goldfinger keeps Bond alive though. In the novel, he had this weird reason where Bond had to do his paperwork with Tilly, who was still alive at this point in the novel. But here, he just keeps him around because he's afraid 008 might replace him. But Bond won't be able to report to MI6 anyway, so shouldn't he still be concerned that someone would come out to look for him? Instead, he just keeps Bond around so he can kill him later in Operation Grand Slam. Oh well, a common criticism at this point of the film, Bond doesn't really do much other than sit around in his cell, makes a silly escape only to be recaptured again later, and I can see where people are coming from, but I feel Bond does try a couple of things of importance. I'll get into that later, but most of all, he's still at the center stage now, being this close to Goldfinger's heart of operation, and it's the only one able to actually try and stop Operation Grand Slam. This is when we finally find out what Operation Grand Slam is. In a very fun sequence, taking place in an underrated Can-Am film set by the way, Goldfinger brought in all these gangsters from several parts of the US that all invested $1 million into Operation Grand Slam. Goldfinger promises them that they will each receive $10 million tomorrow. What is the plan? Well, in typical Bond villain fashion, Goldfinger pushes some buttons and out pops a model of Fort Knox and of course a huge picture of the target area. No Bond villain should go without. And meanwhile, the gangsters are constantly hilariously commenting on every damn thing that Goldfinger is doing.
What's with that trick pool table? Cover him! Hey, cover those doors! Turn those lights back on!
What are you trying to pull, Goldfinger? What's that map doing there?
What's going on here? What is it? It's on the floor, my feet! What is this, a merry-go-round?
Of course, it's highly questionable why Goldfinger would go ahead and explain every last detail of his plan. The dynamiting of the fence, the spraying of a lethal nerve gas to disable the guards around the area, only to use the exact gas to kill all of the gangsters off anyway. Why bother to explain all of this if he could have just activated the gas beforehand? Of course, the real answer is because we as the audience now finally learned what his goal is. But as a Bond fan that likes to think deeper about every damn detail in a film, my attempt of rationalizing this would be, Goldfinger is a bit of a megalomaniac that simply wants to share his genius. He's proud of all the planning and dedication that went into his plan, and he wants to share it with the only people in the world that could possibly appreciate the genius behind it. Other criminals. He just wants to see their jaws drop and see them left impressed before inevitably taking them out of the equation. So like I mentioned before, Bond makes a silly escape. Like seriously, where does the guard think Bond could have possibly gone to? You think he dug a hole within the few minutes he's been in this cell? It gets the job done though, and Bond sneaks his way directly under the Fort Knox model, overhearing Goldfinger's plan of Operation Grand Slam, making notes that he intends to try and get to Felix. That is, until he's discovered by
Pussy.
who takes Bond straight to Goldfinger. He tries to get the Grand Slam notes to Felix with his Homer in the pocket of Mr. Solo, the one gangster who didn't want anything to do with Goldfinger's plan. And here follows an entire sequence which is probably the most pointless that could have ended up on the cutting room floor. John Barry's soundtrack over this whole thing just makes it seem like we're about to watch something spectacular and grand, but we're essentially just watching Oddjob drive Mr. Solo through Kentucky, which is worlds apart from the gorgeous Switzerland sequence from before. While Felix is following him to the car junkyard, where Oddjob takes care of Mr. Solo, and we see the car getting crushed, with the body all of a sudden completely gone, by the way. They could have at least left a dummy on the back seat. And we have to sit through this whole process of the car getting crushed. It's the only part of the film for me that's too slow. I guess now is as good time as any to mention the movie's sound editor, Norman Wanstall, who won the first Oscar in all of Bond for Goldfinger's sound design. I had the pleasure of spending a weekend with Norman in 2022 at the Shaken Not Stirred event. And the man is a legend in playing the craps table, seriously. But he also told the story of this particular scene, and the sound of the actual machine crushing the car. He stumbled on by chance in the studio car park where workmen were just using some sort of compressor, which he recorded last minute with a toy recorder of all things, as he had no equipment around at the time, and then he won an Oscar. It's a fantastic story. So for the sake of the story behind the sound of this sequence, I love it. For the sake of the flow of the plot, I think the film could have worked fine without this whole thing. Arguably, it would have worked even better if we just see Oddjob take off, only for him to arrive moments later with Mr. Solo's remains in the crushed cube, and the rest left to the imagination of the viewer. Then we would be like, holy shit, what happened to Mr. Solo? So Bond's plan to report about Grand Slam has failed. So he has a drink with Goldfinger instead, enjoying the sun. The filmmakers have another improvement over the novel here. You see, in the novel, Operation Grand Slam did in fact come down to a heist operation in which Goldfinger was going to rob Fort Knox with the help of many American gangsters, including Pussy Galore's group. Here in the movie, they actually call out how implausible that really is.
$15 billion in gold bullion weighs 10,500 tons. Would take 12 days to load it onto 200 trucks. Now, at the most, you're going to have 2 hours before the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines move in and make you put it back.
That is until the movie pulls the twist of Goldfinger not actually planning to steal the gold, but to blow up a bomb in it, or as he calls it, an atomic device, rendering the biggest gold supply in the world useless for 58 years because of the radiation, increasing Goldfinger's own gold tremendously. And I love how Goldfinger absolutely enjoys it, how Bond is slowly putting these puzzle pieces together. You can totally see this maniac enjoys people admiring his genius plan, which again buys into my theory I had before as to why Goldfinger loved explaining the plan to the gangsters before killing them. This face says it all, and it's so telling of the character of Goldfinger. It's a real credit to the screenwriters because this makes his plan so much more believable. What follows is a scene in which Pussy suddenly decides to seduce Bond to make Felix and the other CIA guy believe that Bond is in no danger at all. As they move into the barn, we get the moment that is often called out to be on the rapey side, as Bond simply forces his way onto Pussy. While I do agree that if we were to have a scene like this in today's cinema, feminists would probably try and boycott the movie, and yeah, it would be more cringeworthy and maybe controversial to see something like this in modern times. But again, trying to look at this within the context of the time it is made, I don't think the filmmakers had any intention to make this seem rapey at all. It was intended as sort of a 60s love dance, in which Bond has to slowly seduce a woman who essentially gives in. With consent, I must add, as you can clearly see here too. Though by today's standards this is hardly perceived as something romantic, winning a woman over in a way that Bond does do here, but I'm willing to bet that some of our grandparents beg to differ. Within the context of the 60s, it's intended to be much more innocent. And not only that, but the whole winning her over part is essential to the rest of the plot, as we find out later. As Operation Grand Slam goes into effect, again, all of this is 60s cinema in all its glory, and I can't help but always smile at the charm of everything going on the screen here. So the entire army around Fort Knox is knocked out by Pussy's flying circus and the nerve gas, with all the soldiers hilariously falling down on cue. The goons come in to blow up the gate, and the one in front here is an early cameo of a young future Bond producer, Michael G. Wilson, by the way. And Goldfinger flies in, along with the same laser, and all of this is just super entertaining. The interior of Fort Knox, as designed by Ken Adam, is still to this day absolutely jaw-dropping. Nobody knows what the interior of Fort Knox looks like, but the design he came up with is all inspiring. And I also love the look that Goldfinger gives as he first enters the building. You can see the temptation on his face as he looks at the vast stacks of gold. Should he try and steal some of that before setting off the bomb? You can tell that he considers it for a brief second. But no, Grand Slam comes first, and the atomic device, as he calls it, is brought in, and Bond is handcuffed to it. Everything seems to be going painfully according to plan. That is, until the authorities, including Felix, suddenly wake up from the gas, now clued in on the plan. How? All thanks to Bond getting Pussy. She was convinced to switch the fatal Delta 9 gas for a harmless gas, knocking everyone out for just a few minutes, and thus a shootout between the soldiers and Goldfinger's goons commences. And Goldfinger immediately switches to Plan B, wearing US soldier clothes underneath his coat, ruthlessly shooting his own men, convincing the Americans he's one of them, only to shoot them in the back. And it just makes him all the more a classic Bond villain. He's not about to fail his plan now. So the vault is closed and Bond is now trapped with the bomb. Also, Oddjob is left in there to die, and you gotta admire this guy's loyalty to Goldfinger. His other man, Kish, immediately panics and wants to try and defuse the bomb, while Oddjob just wants the plan to succeed, even if that means he'll die. This ensues one of the most exciting climaxes in the series, Bond facing Oddjob and his lethal bowler hat. We know from the build-up in the movie what his hat is capable of and how dangerous this damn thing is. Where Bond's battle with Red Grant in the previous film felt very raw and dark, this one feels more typical cinematic Bond, fighting an overpowered henchman on a larger-than-life film set. An element of a clock ticking away on a bomb, while soldiers in different colors are fighting outside. Much like many more elements in this film, again, it set a template for so much more things we would come to associate a Bond film with. And while the fight might be much more cartoony, or I'd like to say larger than life than the Red Grant one, it still manages to pull you on the edge of your seat, as somehow, within the universe of Bond, it manages to stay believable. The eventual defeat of Oddjob being electrocuted is very good as well, but that likely has something to do with the fact that Harold Sakata was genuinely burning himself, but he didn't let go because Guy Hamilton didn't say cut. So it wasn't just his character that showed insane loyalty. It's a great demise to arguably the most iconic of Bond henchmen. The final seconds are again edge of your seat inducing as Guy Hamilton constantly switches from clock ticking to chaos, to Bond struggling to defuse the bomb while the actual bomb diffuser still seems too far away for the little time that is left. It's very good and it never fails to pull me in, no matter how many times I've watched this film. When eventually the bomb maker does show up to neutralize the bomb, the filmmakers changed it from 3 seconds left on the timer to 007 seconds left, even though the dialogue still fits the original idea.
3 more ticks and Mr. Goldfinger would have hit the jackpot.
Again though, to come back to the argument that Bond doesn't even do that much impressive stuff in this film. I mean, he gets one woman killed in Miami, then he trails Goldfinger to Switzerland, where he gets the sister killed too, and is captured and strapped to a laser that would have killed him had he not talked his way out of it. Then for the rest of the film, he spends his time as a captive until he eventually is strapped to a bomb he himself doesn't even defuse. Even Bond himself seems to be aware of this.
The president wants to thank you personally.
Oh, it was nothing really.
I know that, but he doesn't.
However, in spite of all that, I'd still argue Bond played a major key role in preventing the plan. You see, had he not been spying underneath the model, Grand Slam would have succeeded. Had he not gotten Pussy on his side, no matter how controversial you look at that scene, thousands of innocents would have been killed. Had he not stopped Oddjob, a murderer would have simply gotten away with it. Sure, he's not the one to defuse the bomb, but without Bond, that bomb diffuser wouldn't have been there to begin with. Of course, we're not quite finished yet, as Goldfinger is still alive too, appearing in the plane with some unknown guy who's only seen in this particular shot, by the way. I'm not sure if it's a movie mistake or some guy that is just forgotten about, but either way, it really doesn't matter. This is probably the only sequence I think the book did better. In the book, Goldfinger hijacks a plane and Bond strangles Oddjob, who ends up being the one sucked out of the plane. Also, the communication between Bond and the control tower in the book, announcing himself as Agent 007 after saving the day, is such a cool moment. Here, things are over quite quickly as Bond shoots a window and Goldfinger is sucked out of it in quite a dated effect. It doesn't take away from the movie too much, but the climax in Fort Knox is simply much better. So the plane crashes and our hero gets Pussy under the parachute. So that was another look at Goldfinger, and to come back to my original question whether or not it's overrated, I can still wholeheartedly say that I am in the camp that believes this is an absolute masterpiece for 3 key reasons. Its iconography, its importance to the franchise, and its insanely high entertainment value. When talking about Goldfinger, you just cannot deny it's probably the most iconic Bond film with every other scene. From Bond's white tuxedo lighting the cigarette, with the explosion, the shocking Shirley Bassey's title song, the Golden Girl, the DB5, Oddjob and his bowler hat, the car chase in Switzerland, the laser scene, Pussy Galore's introduction, Goldfinger explaining his Operation Grand Slam, the ingenious production design by Cat Adam. It pretty much has something iconic on the screen every 10 minutes, which brings me to its importance to the franchise. Dr. No was important for starting it all and adapting the literary Bond to the screen. From Russia with Love expanded on that success, but with Goldfinger they invented and perfected the blueprint of the cinematic Bond. This is when the franchise truly started to become its own unique thing, outside of the novels, which brings me to its high entertainment value. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, out of the first 3 movies, I'd say Goldfinger comes from the weakest source material. Dr. No and From Russia with Love are both better books in my opinion. Goldfinger the novel recycles a lot of ideas from the Moonraker novel. which tells you a lot about how good of a job the filmmakers did in adapting it here. It's not only much better than its source material, I think it easily is a vast improvement to the previous two films. That includes the more light-hearted tone and all the arguments you could bring up about Bond not really doing much in the third act. It's a cinematic milestone, the quintessential Bond film, and I have definitely called this film a 24-karat masterpiece before, but it truly is. It's essential watching, not just for Bond fans, but for any movie enthusiast.